In a small observation room in Baltimore, a toddler plays on the floor while adults watch through a one-way mirror. There are toys scattered nearby, a chair against the wall. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Then the child's mother stands, steps out, and for a brief moment, the whole room seems to change. The child pauses. The air tightens. When she returns, what matters is not simply that she is back, but how her return is received. Does the child move toward her with relief? Does he cling, turn away, freeze, or seem unable to settle? Mary Ainsworth and her colleagues were not just watching separation. They were watching something more delicate and perhaps more important. They were watching what happens when presence and safety fail to mean the same thing. That quiet insight would reach far beyond childhood. Over time, psychologists, psychiatrists, and neuroscientists began circling a troubling fact about adult life as well. Human beings do not feel connected merely because other people are nearby. A crowded room does not guarantee warmth. A marriage does not guarantee closeness. A family dinner, an office full of voices, a phone full of messages. Even a life that appears socially full from the outside can still leave a person with the distinct and private feeling of not quite arriving anywhere inside another mind. What looked, at first, like a simple emotional complaint slowly became a deeper scientific puzzle. Researchers approached that puzzle from very different directions. Some traced it to the structure of modern life, to cities, mobility, anonymity, and the thinning of older forms of belonging. Others looked backward into infancy and argued that the mind may learn early whether closeness feels dependable or uncertain. Later, social neuroscience would add another layer, suggesting that loneliness is not just a passing mood, but a state that can alter attention, expectation, and the reading of social threat. The question was no longer why some people spend time alone. It was why the mind can remain lonely even when company is everywhere. So what, exactly, are we searching for in other people that simple proximity cannot provide? And how did science come to understand that the deepest form of loneliness may have less to do with being alone than with failing to feel safely, fully met? The room is not quiet. Glass touches glass somewhere to your left. A laugh rises, breaks apart, and disappears into the larger wash of conversation. Plates shift against a table. A phone lights up in someone's hand, then goes dark. People lean forward, nod, smile, speak in the practiced rhythm of ordinary company. Nothing in the scene appears missing. If you were standing at the door, you might call it warmth. If you glanced in from outside, you might think this was exactly the kind of place that protects a person from loneliness. And yet, for reasons that are hard to explain while they are happening, the distance can begin there, not in silence, not in abandonment, not in the dramatic image of a solitary figure under a single lamp, but in the middle of voices, faces, and shared space. You answer when someone speaks to you. You follow the shape of the conversation. You even smile at the right moment. But a strange thinness has entered the room. The people around you seem close enough to touch and somehow impossibly far away. It feels less like being excluded than like failing to arrive. Something in you remains just outside the circle, looking in. That experience is difficult to describe because it does not always announce itself with pain. Sometimes it arrives as a soft unreality, as if the world has lost a small but essential amount of depth. Sometimes it feels like effort, You listen a little too carefully, searching for the right opening, the right tone, the right expression that will let you pass more fully into the life around you. At other moments, the opposite happens. Words continue around you, but the mind begins to pull back from them, as if conserving itself. You may wonder whether the problem is the room, the people in it, the stage of life you are in, or simply your own temporary mood. Yet the feeling has a peculiar consistency. It is not exactly that nobody is there. It is that nobody seems to meet you where you are. There is company without ease, contact without rest, and because the outer scene appears normal, even pleasant, the inner disconnection can feel faintly shameful, as though you have failed at a basic human task that others manage without thinking. This is one reason loneliness can remain hidden for so long. Solitude is visible. An empty apartment is visible. A person eating alone in a station cafe is visible. But the form of loneliness that matters here does not always leave an obvious picture behind. It can exist inside marriages, family gatherings, offices, classrooms, religious communities, friend groups, and cities whose streets are dense with movement from morning until late at night. It can exist in the pause after speaking, when nothing in the other person's face quite answers what you meant. It can exist in a life that appears socially full when viewed from a distance. Many people learn to move through it quietly. They keep appointments, reply to messages, attend birthdays, go to work, sit at the table, and continue to function. From the outside, they remain woven into ordinary life. From the inside, something essential has thinned. The old assumption that loneliness simply means being alone begins to feel inadequate almost at once. Science would eventually become interested in that inadequacy, but long before laboratories, scales, and public health reports, human beings had already noticed that there was more than one way to be apart. There is the aloneness a person chooses, and the aloneness a person suffers. There is the hush of early morning before the rest of a household wakes, which can feel restorative. And there is the silence that settles after reaching for someone who does not really reach back. There is privacy, which protects the self, and there is severance, which makes the self feel unanswered. Even ordinary language struggles here. We often use the same words for states that are inwardly quite different. A person may want time alone and feel nourished by it. Another may spend an entire day among others and go to bed with the unmistakable sense of having been untouched by any genuine exchange. The paradox is not a poetic flourish. It is a practical confusion at the center of modern emotional life. People are taught to count presence and mistake it for connection. They are taught to measure closeness by frequency, access, or social visibility, then quietly wonder why the ache remains. Once you begin to notice this distinction, the world changes shape a little. Crowded spaces become harder to read at face value. The commuter train at dusk, full of bodies swaying in near unison, no longer looks like the opposite of loneliness. The open plan office, with its constant sound and perpetual mutual visibility, no longer seems immune to it either. Even the family home, that old symbol of human closeness, begins to reveal another possibility. People can share a roof, a table, and a history and still fail, day after day, to offer one another the kind of attention that makes a person feel recognized. The mind is sensitive to this in ways that are almost embarrassingly precise. It notices tone, timing, consistency, warmth, dismissal, divided attention, ritual politeness. the difference between being tolerated and being welcomed. It notices when conversation remains on the surface because nobody trusts it to go deeper. It notices when affection is offered as duty rather than presence. It notices when the body of another person is near, but their mind is elsewhere, much later. Researchers would try to explain why these subtleties matter so much. For now, it is enough to see that they do. Loneliness is not always born from absence. Sometimes it is born from contact that fails to become connection. That failure can be all the more disorienting because the body does not treat it as a mere idea. A person who feels lonely in a crowd often does not experience the problem as an abstract social insight. The sensation has texture. Time stretches oddly. Speech can begin to feel effortful or strangely weightless. One becomes hyper-aware of small signs, of who turns toward whom, of how easily warmth seems to circulate between other people, of how difficult it can be to relax into the flow of exchange without monitoring it. In some moments, there is even a sharp desire to leave, not because solitude is preferable in itself, but because it is less exhausting than remaining where connection seems possible and yet never quite lands. This is one of the cruelest features of the experience. The lonely person is not always cut off from human contact. Often they are pressed painfully close to its image. They can see what connection looks like, hear its rhythms, imitate its outer form, and still feel barred from its deeper ease. For a very long time, such moments were easy to dismiss. They could be written off as melancholy, temperament, oversensitivity, shyness, pride, depression, social awkwardness, or merely one of those private discomforts that civilized life asks people to conceal. Even in the modern age, loneliness was often treated as something obvious and therefore uninteresting. If a person lacked companionship, then the explanation seemed ready at hand. If they had companions and still felt lonely, that could look like a personal puzzle rather than a scientific one. But slowly, and with more hesitation than we often remember, thinkers began to recognize that this feeling had its own logic. It was not identical to solitude. It was not identical to sadness. Nor was it simply a social count, as though the mind kept a ledger of how many bodies stood nearby. Something more elusive was at work. Something that had to do with how human beings register one another inwardly. That realization would eventually force an important distinction into view. Social isolation and loneliness are not the same thing. One refers to the visible structure of a life, the degree of contact, the availability of others, the actual pattern of social ties. The other belongs to felt experience. It is possible to have very few relationships and not feel lonely at all. It is also possible to be embedded in daily contact and still experience a steady lack of meaningful connection. Once this difference is understood, the old images become unreliable guides. The empty room no longer tells the whole story, and neither does the full one. What matters is not only whether people are present. What matters is how that presence is received, interpreted, trusted, and lived inside. Company may reduce isolation without touching loneliness. A crowded life may protect a person from physical aloneness while leaving the deeper need for recognition unanswered. This is where the subject begins to open into something larger than emotion in the narrow sense. Loneliness does not merely describe a mood that passes over the mind and leaves it unchanged. It raises a harder question about what the mind is actually looking for in other people. Not simply proximity, because proximity fails every day. Not simply conversation, because conversation can remain mechanical. Not simply inclusion, because a person can be invited, welcomed, and still feel unknown. The mystery seems to lie in a more delicate region of experience, somewhere between perception and trust. Human beings appear to need other minds in a very particular way. They need more than access. They need a kind of felt mutuality. The sense that one's inner life has made contact with the inner life of another and has found there some measure of steadiness, attention, or rest. Without that, the social world may remain visible and yet strangely unavailable, like a light behind glass. The more carefully one looks, the more radical that idea becomes. It suggests that belonging is not merely a public fact. It is not guaranteed by membership, by role, by family title, by reputation, or by the density of one's daily interactions. Belonging has an inward side, and that inward side can fracture in places where all the visible forms remain intact. This helps explain why some of the most piercing loneliness appears not at the edges of society, but within its ordinary arrangements. A person may be the reliable friend, the attentive parent, the competent colleague, the agreeable partner, the one who replies, the one who shows up, the one whose life from the outside appears threaded with connection. Yet if those roles do not allow for a deeper experience of being known, then the performance of social life can become exhausting rather than sustaining. It can begin to feel as though one is endlessly present without ever being met. No single moment in history produced this insight all at once. It emerged gradually, through discomfort, observation, and the stubborn refusal of ordinary life to fit simple explanations. At first, the paradox was easy to miss because many societies inherited an older faith in the crowd, the household, the village, the congregation, the extended family, the street filled with familiar faces. To live among others was assumed, often with good reason, to be one of the primary defenses against psychic emptiness. Human beings had always feared abandonment. They had feared exile, widowhood, orphanhood, banishment, isolation in the literal sense. Those fears were real and remain real. But somewhere in the making of the modern world, another possibility became harder to ignore. It was possible to remain socially surrounded and still feel internally unheld. It was possible for the bonds between people to persist outwardly while weakening in texture, confidence, and depth. You can sense the edge of that change by thinking again of the room where this section began. Nothing was missing that an observer could easily count. The chairs were filled. The talk continued. The evening had all the visible ingredients of togetherness. And still the mind, in its private and often unsparing way, had begun to register another truth. Presence was not enough. Nearness was not enough. The old visual grammar of loneliness had broken down. The loneliest place was not always empty. Sometimes it was crowded, lit, conversational, and outwardly complete. Sometimes what hurt most was not being cut off from others altogether, but remaining so close to connection while feeling unable to enter it fully. That is the threshold on which this story begins, not with a final answer, and not with a lecture about definitions, but with a quiet failure inside ordinary human company. Once that failure is taken seriously, the world becomes full of new questions. Why do some forms of togetherness soothe the mind while others leave it untouched? Why does one presence feel dependable and another strangely unreachable? Why can the same social environment sustain one person and drain another? And how did a feeling once dismissed as private sadness become a subject that drew in psychiatrists, developmental researchers, social psychologists, neuroscientists, and public health thinkers alike? To understand that, We have to step out of the room for a while and look at the larger world that made this paradox easier to see. The modern world of crowded streets, growing cities, loosened traditions, and new forms of social life, where human beings began living closer together in space, while often feeling less securely held within the structures around them. If we step outside that room and keep walking, the puzzle changes scale. The unease that seemed so private begins to look strangely historical. The dinner table gives way to a street, the street to a neighborhood, the neighborhood to a city whose lights go on one window at a time as evening settles over rows of stone, brick, and glass. There are more people here than any earlier century would have thought natural. More movement, more contact, more chances to cross paths with strangers in a single day than many rural lives once offered in a month. And yet, in the middle of that human density, a new kind of uncertainty begins to appear. The old protections of belonging have not exactly vanished, but they no longer surround a person with the same unquestioned force. By the late 19th century, Europe was being reorganized at almost every level of life. Villages emptied into factory towns. Railways compressed distance. Letters, newspapers, and telegraphs made it possible to live inside events unfolding far away. Families moved for work. Children grew up where their grandparents had never stood. People who once would have remained within a web of kinship perish. Local custom, inherited trade, and familiar reputation increasingly found themselves in places where they were known first as workers, tenants, clerks, students, customers, commuters, or citizens. None of this was simple decline. There was energy in it, possibility in it, freedom in it too. The expanding city could offer escape from old confinements and open paths that smaller worlds had denied. But the price of that mobility was often harder to name. A person could gain room to move while losing the invisible net that had once held their life together. This did not mean that earlier societies were warm and harmonious in some uncomplicated way. Village life could be cruel. Gossip could wound. Religious conformity could suffocate. And family obligation could feel less like belonging than entrapment. Historians are right to resist easy nostalgia here. Still, the older arrangements had a certain texture of embeddedness. You were located before you had fully chosen yourself. Others often knew where you fit, what was expected of you, and how your life touched theirs. In the new urban order, that kind of placement grew less stable. One could pass through crowds and remain largely unrecognized. One could rent a room, change jobs, move districts, alter one's circle, and carry on with a freedom that was exhilarating for some and disorienting for others. A life became more portable, and in becoming portable, it could also become lighter in ways that were not always liberating. Writers, novelists, reformers, and social observers began to notice this change before the new sciences had fully named it. The city was often described as a place of stimulation and strain at once. Streets were crowded, but the crowd did not necessarily gather into fellowship. Public life grew louder, while inward life often turned more guarded. A person learned how to be near others without entering into relation with them. In train compartments, en boulevard, inside apartment blocks, at counters and in offices, one performed countless brief acts of coordination with people who remained functionally important and personally distant. The growing metropolis taught its own social techniques, how to glance without staring, how to stand near without acknowledging, how to maintain a shell of composure under the pressure of perpetual contact. You could spend the day touched on every side by evidence of other lives and still feel that none of those lives had made a place for yours. It was in that wider atmosphere that sociology emerged as one of the new disciplines trying to understand what industrial society was doing to the human condition. Among its central figures was Émile Durkheim. Born in 1858 in the French city of Épinal, raised in a Jewish family with a strong scholarly tradition, and shaped by a period in which France, like much of Europe, was wrestling with secularization, political upheaval, and the social consequences of rapid change. Durkheim had the temperament of a builder. He wanted sociology to become a rigorous discipline, one capable of studying social facts with seriousness, rather than leaving questions of moral order to vague commentary or literary impression alone. Yet for all the discipline in his method, the problems that drew him in were intensely human. He was preoccupied by cohesion, obligation, moral life, education, ritual, and the strange way a society can either hold people together or fail to do so. Durkheim did not set out to explain loneliness in the sense we use the word now. He was after something broader and, in some respects, even more difficult. He wanted to know what binds individuals into a social world sturdy enough to orient their lives. He was asking how modern societies maintain solidarity when old bonds weaken, occupations diversify, religious authority loosens, and people no longer live within the same dense sameness of custom and belief that marked earlier communities. Behind that question lay a quiet alarm. If society is not merely a collection of individuals, but a real force shaping thought, conduct, and meaning, then what happens when that force thins, fragments, or fails to reach some people with enough strength? His major works approach this from different directions. In The Division of Labor in Society, published in 1893, Durkheim argued that traditional communities had often been organized around what he called mechanical solidarity, a cohesion rooted in similarity, shared faith, common labor, and a relatively unified moral world. More complex societies, by contrast, had to develop organic solidarity, a form of interdependence arising from difference, specialization, and the need that distinct roles have for one another. This was not a simple lament for the past. Durkheim did not imagine history could reverse itself and return to a village order. He understood that the new forms of life were real, durable, and in many ways necessary. Still, there was a tension at the center of his thought. A society built on specialization might be efficient, dynamic, and expansive, yet if its moral bonds were weak or poorly organized, individuals could be left in a condition of uncertainty, no longer held securely by either the old order or the new one. A few years later, in Suicide, he took on a subject so intimate and devastating that it had often been treated as the most private of acts. Durkheim's move was startling. He argued that even here, even in an act many assumed could only be understood through individual psychology or personal tragedy, social forces were powerfully present. Differences in suicide rates, he suggested, were not random reflections of isolated suffering. They bore the imprint of integration and regulation, of how bound people were to collective life, and how firmly their desires, expectations, and conduct were contained within a moral framework. When integration weakened, certain forms of vulnerability became more likely. When regulation failed, another instability emerged. This was not loneliness research in the modern empirical sense. but it did something decisive. It made it possible to speak about inner anguish as partly social in origin, shaped by the condition of the world around the person and not reducible to temperament alone. One of Durkheim's most influential ideas was anomie, a term often translated as normlessness, though the experience he was describing was more textured than that word can easily carry. Anomie names a state in which the rules, limits, and expectations that ordinarily help anchor desire and conduct lose their grip. A person is no longer guided by a stable sense of what is enough, what is expected, what can be hoped for, or how life is meant to be ordered. In times of economic upheaval, sudden prosperity, political rupture, or institutional breakdown, this condition can spread. The individual is not merely set free. He or she may also become unmoored. Durkheim's insight matters here because loneliness often thrives in precisely that ambiguity. It is easier to feel unsupported when the surrounding order no longer tells you where you stand, what binds you to others, or what kind of claim you may reasonably place on them. Imagine, for a moment, the social feeling of such a world. You are less constrained by old authorities, yet also less enclosed by them. Your life is more self-directed, but also more exposed to comparison, uncertainty, and fluctuation. Work may connect you to vast systems while leaving the substance of your daily relations oddly thin. Institutions speak to you as an individual, a voter, a consumer, a professional, a case, a unit. Categories that organize collective life efficiently and yet often fail to answer the deeper need to feel known in one's full particularity. The scale of society grows larger, while the sense of being held by it can grow smaller. Durkheim was not describing a crowded cafe or a lonely marriage. He was tracing the social weather in which those experiences become easier to produce and harder to interpret. Around him, other thinkers were also struggling to describe the change. Ferdinand Tönnies drew a famous contrast between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, terms often translated as community and society, to capture the difference between intimate, customary forms of association and the more impersonal, contractual relationships of the modern order. Georg Simmel, writing about metropolitan life, noticed the peculiar mental habits cities demanded: reserve, calculation, a kind of protective distance developed under constant stimulation. None of these thinkers was offering a loneliness scale or a neuroscience model. What they shared was the intuition that proximity in modern life had altered its meaning. People were coming together in new ways, under new pressures, with new freedoms and new forms of estrangement woven into the same fabric. The crowd no longer guaranteed communion. This mattered because human beings read their place in the world partly through continuity. To feel securely situated usually requires more than one-off interactions and formal membership in institutions. It depends on repeated recognition, mutual expectation, stable roles, and the sense that one's life is legible to others in a way that extends beyond immediate utility. In older settings, that legibility could be oppressive. In newer ones, its absence could be exhausting. The modern city produced unprecedented forms of contact, while also training people to economize feeling, to move efficiently between roles, to present fragments of themselves suited to the workplace, the street, the market, the bureaucracy. Under such conditions, social life could become abundant in encounter and sparse in depth. The person surrounded by others was no longer necessarily contained within a moral world dense enough to absorb private distress. There is a subtlety here worth lingering over. Durkheim never claimed that every loosening of tradition produced misery, nor that all collective life was healthy simply because it was collective. His interest was in balance, in how societies hold together without crushing the individuals inside them, and how individuals remain free without drifting into disorientation. That tension remains recognizable now. Too much constraint suffocates. Too little shared structure can leave people suspended, self-governing in theory and inwardly unsupported in practice. This is one reason his work still feels relevant to the quieter forms of loneliness that appear in prosperous, connected, outwardly functional lives. A person may have opportunities, movement, independence, even admiration, and still experience the dull ache of standing in relation to others without feeling meaningfully bound to them. The modern condition, then, did not invent human separation, but it sharpened a particular version of it. Earlier eras feared exile and abandonment in visible forms. The 19th and early 20th centuries began to illuminate another possibility: life inside expanding systems where one could remain socially present and yet insufficiently integrated at the level of meaning. Work connected millions who never truly met. Cities offered nearness without intimacy. Institutions classified individuals with increasing precision while often leaving their deeper longings untouched. Under those circumstances, a person might not say, "I have no one." The truer sentence might be harder to speak: "I am among people. And still, I do not feel carried by any common life." That shift would have consequences far beyond sociology. Once the sources of human distress were seen as partly embedded in patterns of integration, regulation, and social form, the door opened to new questions. If the surrounding order matters so much, why do some people remain more vulnerable than others within the same society? Why does one individual manage anonymity with ease while another feels hollowed out by it? Why do some bonds withstand the thinning of communal life, and others collapse into formality, resentment, or private distance? The big social frame was illuminating, but it did not fully explain the intimate variations of experience. One person could move through the same historical world and still feel inwardly steadier than another. Somewhere beneath the architecture of cities and institutions, another layer of the story was waiting. That next layer would draw attention away from boulevards, workplaces, census tables, and theories of solidarity, and toward a smaller scene, more private, more fragile, and in some ways more decisive, long before adults enter offices, neighborhoods, friendships, and marriages. They first learn what closeness feels like in the presence of another human being. They learn whether comfort arrives when distress rises, whether separation feels temporary or catastrophic, whether return brings ease or uncertainty. The crowded modern world may intensify the paradox of feeling alone among others. But to understand why that paradox settles so differently into different lives, we have to move closer to the beginning, to the earliest bond, where presence first becomes something more than mere physical nearness, or fails to. That smaller scene begins so early that most of us will never remember it directly. A room, perhaps light falling across a carpet, the outline of a doorway, the ordinary rhythm of a caretaker moving through the day, coming near, moving away, returning again. For an infant, these are not background details. They are among the first coordinates from which the world takes shape. Before society appears as city, school, workplace, or crowd, it arrives in a simpler and more consequential form, a face leaning close, a voice answering distress, arms that pick up or do not, a departure that lasts too long, a return that restores calm, or somehow fails to. Long before a person can explain loneliness, the nervous system may already be learning something about what closeness feels like. This was not always how psychologists spoke about early life. For a long time, especially in the first half of the 20th century, dominant theories often treated the bond between infant and mother in relatively narrow terms. In some behaviorist accounts, attachment could be understood largely through conditioning. The child became attached to the person associated with feeding, relief, and the reduction of discomfort. There was a practical elegance to that idea. It fit a broader scientific mood that preferred observable reinforcement to anything that sounded sentimental or vaguely instinctive. But it left something out, and the missing part was becoming harder to ignore. Children seemed to need more than nourishment. They seemed to seek proximity itself. And from that proximity, they seemed to draw a kind of regulation that could not be reduced to food alone. John Bowlby was one of the figures who helped bring that missing part into focus. Born in London in 1907 into an upper-middle-class British family, he came of age within a culture that often treated emotional reserve as a virtue and chilled rearing as something that could be delegated without much psychological cost. Like many children of his class and period, he was cared for extensively by a nanny and then sent away to boarding school while still quite young. Biographers have often noted the possible resonance between these early separations and his later scientific concerns. Though it would be too simple to treat his theory as autobiography in disguise, Bowlby's work emerged from a wide field of clinical practice: wartime observation, psychoanalysis, ethology, and developmental study. What matters more than the biographical echo is the direction in which he forced the question. He asked what a child is actually seeking in the presence of a caregiver, and what happens when that presence is inconsistent, unavailable, or lost. His clinical work with troubled and delinquent children had already drawn his attention to separation and emotional deprivation. During and after the Second World War, these questions became more urgent. Europe had lived through evacuation, institutional care, orphanhood, displacement, and the large-scale dislocation of family life. Bowlby's 1951 report for the World Health Organization, Maternal Care and Mental Health, argued that a young child should experience a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with the mother or a permanent mother substitute in which both find satisfaction and enjoyment. The language of that era now sounds narrower than current developmental science would prefer. Later researchers would widen the picture beyond the mother alone and stress the importance of reliable caregiving more generally. Even so, Bowlby had placed something vital at the center of the conversation. Emotional continuity was not a luxury. It belonged to the foundations of mental life. His theory of attachment, developed more fully across the decades that followed, drew from several sources at once. Psychoanalysis had accustomed clinicians to thinking about early experience as formative. Ethologists such as Konrad Lorenz had shown that many animals display built-in patterns of attachment and proximity-seeking behavior. Bowlby took these currents and proposed that human infants are biologically prepared to maintain closeness to caregivers because such closeness serves survival. Crying, clinging, following, reaching, smiling. These were not random behaviors. They formed part of an attachment system shaped by evolution to keep a vulnerable child near protective adults. Yet Bowlby's deepest insight was not simply that children seek protection. It was that the meaning of closeness gradually becomes internal. Through repeated exchanges, the child builds expectations about whether others will be available, responsive, and emotionally reachable in times of need. You can feel how this shifts the subject. The question is no longer only whether a caregiver is physically present in the room. The more delicate question is what that presence means to the child. Does it settle the body? Does it organize fear? Does it allow exploration because return feels possible? Or does presence itself remain unreliable? Too brief, too distracted, too unpredictable to create safety from within? Bowlby described patterns of protest, despair, and detachment in children separated from caregivers for extended periods. At first, a child may cry, search, resist consolation. Later, if separation continues, there may be withdrawal, sadness, diminished responsiveness. In some cases, when reunion finally comes, relief is not simple. The child may appear distant, turned away, as though something in the bond has shifted under the pressure of loss. These were not merely dramatic episodes of childhood upset. They suggested that the mind was learning how much trust to place in closeness itself. This line of thought gained extraordinary observational precision through the work of Mary Ainsworth. Born in Ohio in 1913 and trained in Canada before later working in London with Bowlby, Ainsworth brought a rare combination of patience, conceptual clarity, and close attention to actual behavior. She was not satisfied with grand theory alone. She wanted to see how attachment unfolded in lived interactions, in homes, in ordinary care, in moments of distress and recovery. Her fieldwork in Uganda in the 1950s, and later in Baltimore, helped her notice something decisive. Children differed not only in how strongly they sought caregivers, but in how confidently they used caregivers as a secure base from which to engage the world. That phrase, secure base, would become one of the quiet organizing ideas of attachment research. A child who trusts the availability of a caregiver is often freer to explore. Curiosity expands because return feels dependable. The adult is both refuge and reference point, a place to move away from and back toward without terror. This is a deeply important pattern for understanding loneliness later in life. It suggests that connection and independence are not opposites in the healthiest form of development. Reliable closeness does not trap the child. It permits movement. Emotional security makes exploration easier because the background of safety is strong enough to bear temporary absence. In Baltimore, Ainsworth and her colleagues developed what became known as the strange situation, a structured observational procedure first published in 1978. Though its conceptual roots lay earlier, the setup was elegantly simple. A young child, usually around 1 year old, was brought into an unfamiliar room with the caregiver. A stranger entered. The caregiver left and returned in a sequence designed to activate the child's attachment system through mild stress. The researchers were not interested in theatrical distress for its own sake. They were watching the logic of reunion. How did the child respond when the caregiver came back? Did proximity bring comfort? Could the child be soothed and return to exploration? Or did the reunion produce clinging without calm? Avoidance without relief, confusion without resolution? From these observations emerged patterns that Ainsworth identified as secure, anxious resistant, and avoidant attachment, with later researchers adding disorganized attachment as an important further category. The labels mattered less here than the emotional architecture they revealed. Some children seemed to expect that their needs would be met well enough to allow distress and recovery to flow into one another. Others seemed uncertain, amplifying bids for contact while remaining hard to soothe. Some turned away, minimizing outward signs of need, as though closeness were safer when emotional demand was kept hidden. These were not little character types, nor fixed destinies written forever in infancy. Ainsworth herself was attentive to context and caregiving quality. Still, the strange situation gave science something it had long lacked, a way to observe that nearness and reassurance were not identical. There is a remarkable quietness to that discovery. No grand machine, no spectacular instrument. Just a room, a separation, a return, and within that small choreography, a profound fact about human beings became clearer. Being near another person does not automatically bring calm. The body asks a subtler question. Is this closeness dependable? Is this person emotionally available when I am distressed? Can I rest here? Presence, in other words, may fail to become safety. And when it does, something in the developing mind adapts around that failure. Other researchers, working from different angles, had already seen related signs. René Spitz, an Austrian-born psychoanalyst who later worked in the United States, studied infants in institutional settings during the 1940s and described severe developmental consequences among children who were physically cared for, yet deprived of consistent emotional contact. His writings on hospitalism and anaclitic depression became widely discussed, though historians and developmental scholars have since treated some early interpretations with caution. Institutional settings varied, and many forms of deprivation were entangled there: understaffing, poor stimulation, illness, unstable care, social neglect. It would be too easy to isolate one variable and declare the matter solved. Even so, the broader lesson remained haunting. Survival conditions alone were not enough. A child could receive feeding, cleaning, and shelter, and still suffer deeply if human responsiveness was thin, fragmented, or absent. This point mattered because it cut against an older picture of development as something more mechanical. It also forced psychiatry and psychology to admit how much the earliest bond regulates distress. When an infant cries and is soothed, something more is happening than the end of a brief upset. A pattern is being laid down. A relationship between discomfort and relief is taking form. The world is becoming, in a primitive but powerful sense, either answerable or uncertain. With repetition, the child may come to expect that signals sent outward will meet an intelligible response. Or the child may learn a harder lesson. That need does not reliably call forth comfort. That closeness is inconsistent. That one must intensify distress to be noticed, or suppress it to preserve whatever contact is available. Those are very early arrangements of feeling. They do not dictate a life completely, but they can shape the atmosphere in which later relationships are interpreted. By now, the connection to adult loneliness begins to look less metaphorical. If early experience teaches the mind whether reaching outward tends to bring steadiness or confusion, then later social life is never built on a blank surface. The lonely person in the crowded room is not merely reacting to the room. Often that person is also reacting through habits of expectation formed long before the room itself existed. One individual enters company with a basic confidence that closeness can be real. Another enters with vigilance, uncertainty, or a quiet assumption that being near others may still leave something essential unanswered. Two people may receive the same invitation, hear the same tone, sit at the same table, and inhabit very different emotional worlds because they are not starting from the same felt history of what presence means. Bowlby eventually spoke of internal working models, mental representations of self and others built from early attachment experiences. The phrase can sound technical, but the idea is simple enough at heart. Through repeated interactions, children come to hold implicit expectations about whether they are worthy of care, whether others are likely to respond, and whether intimacy is a place of refuge, disappointment, confusion, or strain. These models are not consciously recited. They operate more like background assumptions. A person may not say, "I expect distance," and yet live as though that expectation were quietly governing attention, trust, and interpretation. In adult life, such assumptions can help explain why some forms of companionship feel nourishing while others stir anxiety, withdrawal, or emptiness. It is important, though, not to turn attachment theory into fate. Development is not a prison sentence issued in infancy. Later relationships matter. So do friendship, partnership, therapy, community, culture, and the many ways people continue to change across a lifetime. Bowlby himself never argued that early experience was the whole story. The danger lies in flattening a powerful insight into a deterministic slogan. What attachment research offers is not a final map of every later feeling. It offers a convincing account of why closeness itself can carry different emotional meanings for different people, and why the mere presence of others does not guarantee that those meanings will converge into comfort. There was also controversy around Bowlby's work, especially in its earlier reception. Some critics worried that emphasis on maternal care risked burdening women with a crushing moral responsibility or blaming mothers too simply for later difficulties. That concern was not imaginary. Mid-century child development discourse could become moralizing, and later feminists and scholars rightly pushed back against crude interpretations. Over time, attachment research broadened beyond a single maternal figure and became more nuanced about multiple caregivers, context, and family variation. Yet the core insight survived the debate. Human beings are shaped by patterns of responsiveness. The nervous system does not treat all forms of care as equivalent. There is a difference between bodily maintenance and emotional attunement, between someone being there and someone functioning as a reliable source of regulation. And that difference runs quietly through adult life. It appears in the ease with which one person confides and another edits every sentence before speaking. It appears in the feeling of exhale that some relationships allow and the constant calibration others require. It appears in the subtle shock of discovering, sometimes very late, that proximity has never fully meant reassurance. Loneliness around people begins to make more sense once we accept that the human need involved is not merely social exposure. It is the need for another person whose presence can be used inwardly. Someone against whom fear, uncertainty, and distress can settle enough for the self to feel less alone inside its own experience. By the middle decades of the 20th century, this recognition was gaining force, but it had not yet fully displaced the older assumptions. Many psychologists still preferred cleaner, more external explanations. Others accepted the importance of attachment without understanding how deep the need for comfort ran. The next turn in the story would sharpen that issue in an unforgettable way. In a laboratory, through a series of experiments as famous as they were troubling, researchers would confront a question that earlier theories had handled too narrowly. When the young seek a caregiver, are they seeking food or something softer, stranger, and more essential than feeding can explain? That question led, in the middle of the 20th century, into a laboratory in Wisconsin, a place of metal cages. controlled conditions, clipboards, white coats, and a style of science that liked its answers clean. If earlier observers had watched children in homes, hospitals, nurseries, and consulting rooms, here the setting was stripped down almost to abstraction. The subjects were infant rhesus monkeys. The question, at least in its formal scientific shape, concerned attachment. Why do the young become attached to a caregiver? What exactly are they seeking? If the older behaviorist language were right, then the answer ought to center on feeding, reinforcement, and the reduction of biological need. Hunger would create the bond. Food would explain the preference. But once the experiments began, that tidy picture started to loosen. Harry Harlow, who became one of the most famous and controversial psychologists of his era, did not enter this story as a gentle theorist of tenderness. He was an experimentalist, trained in a scientific culture that prized controlled results and often distrusted anything that sounded soft, moral, or overly humanistic. At the University of Wisconsin, where he built a major primate research program, Harlow developed a reputation for boldness, ingenuity, and at times a bleakly sardonic style. He worked in a period when psychology was still heavily shaped by behaviorism, even as cracks were opening in its confidence. Emotional life had not been absent from earlier research, but many scientists remained wary of words like love, comfort, or affection. Those terms seemed too vague, too contaminated by sentiment, too difficult to convert into measurable variables. Harlow's peculiar achievement was that he forced psychology to test them anyway. The design of his most famous studies now sounds almost stark in its simplicity. Infant monkeys were separated from their biological mothers and raised with surrogate figures made of different materials. One surrogate was constructed from bare wire and equipped with a bottle for feeding. Another, in some conditions, was covered in soft cloth and offered no milk at all. If feeding were the decisive basis of attachment, the infants should have preferred the wire figure that supplied nourishment. Yet again and again, the monkeys spent far more time clinging to the cloth surrogate. They approached the wire mother mainly to feed, then returned to the softer one as if drawn by a need that food alone could not satisfy. In threatening situations, they ran toward softness, not toward the source of milk. The result was difficult to ignore. Something in the young creature sought tactile reassurance, bodily comfort, and a kind of felt safety that could not be reduced to calories for a modern audience. The conclusion may sound almost obvious. Of course, the infant wanted warmth and softness. Of course, comfort mattered. Yet the historical force of the finding lay precisely in how much it challenged a narrower language of attachment. Harlow would later call this contact comfort, a phrase plain enough to survive because it named a real and observable preference. The infant monkey did not simply attach to the figure associated with feeding. It attached to the one that provided a more soothing physical experience. That distinction seems small until one follows its implications. It means that care is not merely maintenance. It means that closeness can have a regulating function of its own. It means that the young do not only seek survival in the crude sense. They seek a form of bodily reassurance that helps organize fear. Harlow's experiments went further. In some settings, the infant monkeys were placed in unfamiliar environments with their surrogate mothers nearby. The soft figure served as a kind of anchor. When frightened, the young animals rushed back to it. When calmer, they sometimes moved out to explore and then returned again. There, in a highly artificial space, one could see something uncannily close to Ainsworth's secure base in another form of life. Safety permitted exploration. Fear narrowed movement. A reliable point of return widened it again. The insight was not that monkeys and humans were identical, nor that a cloth form could replace a living relationship. Rather, the experiments made visible a pattern many theories had blurred. Feeding, comfort, proximity, and emotional regulation were related but not interchangeable. The language Harlow used was striking because it flirted with words that psychology had often preferred to avoid. He wrote and spoke about affectional systems, about love in a scientifically provocative register, and about the consequences of deprivation in ways that were impossible to confine to the old stimulus-response frame. There was something almost confrontational in this. He was not merely adding a small correction to prevailing views. He was insisting that the discipline had underestimated the force of attachment. In public imagination, his cloth mothers became iconic because they turned a complicated theoretical dispute into a scene anyone could understand. A creature in distress reached not for food, but for comfort. A whole generation of readers, students, clinicians, and ordinary observers recognized in that image something they had felt before they had the language to defend it. At the same time, the experiments carried a shadow that has only deepened with time. The very clarity of the results depended on separation, confinement, and controlled deprivation. The infant monkey's suffering was not an accidental byproduct, but part of the design. Harlow's later studies, involving more severe isolation, are among the most disturbing episodes in 20th century psychology. Even in his own era, some observers felt unease. Those standards of animal research were different, and the full ethical reckoning was still taking shape. Today, it is impossible to discuss the scientific impact without acknowledging the cost. The work changed psychology, but it did so by causing harm. That tension belongs to the history of the idea itself. Some of the most memorable lessons about attachment arrived through methods that now force us to ask what scientific knowledge should demand of living beings. Yet if we remain with the intellectual effect of the early surrogate mother studies, we can see why they landed with such force. They gave experimental leverage to an argument that had previously depended more heavily on clinical observation, developmental interpretation, and cross-species analogy. Bowlby's theory had already challenged narrower accounts of attachment, but Harlow furnished a blunt demonstration. Comfort was not decorative. It was not an indulgence layered atop more basic needs once hunger was satisfied. It belonged to the structure of attachment itself. The infant organism sought something in the caregiver's presence that was emotionally organizing, physically soothing, and behaviorally stabilizing. Under fear, that need showed itself with even greater clarity. This helped shift the tone of the wider conversation. Psychologists could still debate the details, how to compare species, how far to generalize, how strongly to privilege maternal presence over broader caregiving patterns. But it became harder to speak as though affection were a vague extra. A person did not become securely attached simply because the body was kept alive. Maintenance and comfort could diverge. Nearness and reassurance could diverge. A caretaker could be present and still fail to provide the kind of regulation the young required. That idea resonates so powerfully because it does not remain in infancy. Once accepted, it travels outward through later life. It suggests that the body learns from how care is delivered, and that those lessons may persist even when the outward forms of social life look intact. Around the edges of this scientific shift, there were also confusions and harmful interpretations. Mid-century thought about children, mothers, deprivation, An emotional disturbance could become accusatory in ways that cause lasting damage. One notorious example came through theories associated with Bruno Bettelheim, who promoted the now discredited and deeply harmful idea that cold, detached refrigerator mothers contributed to autism. That framework lacked solid evidence and cast blame in ways later judged profoundly unjust. Harlow himself sharply criticized Bettelheim's claims. The broader lesson here is important. Once psychology admitted that emotional connection mattered, it did not always handle that insight wisely. A true recognition that attunement and warmth are developmentally important could still be distorted into simplistic moral blame. Scientific progress does not always move cleanly. Sometimes a field reaches toward a real human truth and mishandles it before learning how to think more carefully. The maternal deprivation debates of the mid-20th century reveal that tension clearly. Bowlby's early emphasis on the mother-child relationship was historically understandable, shaped by the data, institutions, and assumptions available to him. But many readers took such work in rigid directions, as if any maternal absence or any departure from a narrow family ideal were psychologically catastrophic by definition. Later scholarship would complicate this view. Children can form strong attachments to fathers, grandparents, adoptive parents, and other consistent caregivers. Context matters. Continuity matters. The quality and reliability of care matter. Still, beneath the oversimplifications, one insight continued to hold. Human development is altered by the difference between being physically managed and being emotionally held. That phrase, emotionally held, is not a technical term, but it comes close to the human meaning of what the experiments made visible. The infant monkey clinging to cloth did not demonstrate a preference for abstract softness in isolation. The response pointed to a need for regulation through contact, a need for the body to settle against something that signaled safety. In human life, of course, the picture is richer and more reciprocal. A caregiver is not a surface. There is voice, smell, timing, familiarity, expression, responsiveness, and the subtle dance through which distress is first met and then eased. But the laboratory results stripped away enough complexity to leave one thing plain. The young seek more than sustenance. They seek a form of comfort that becomes part of how the world feels bearable. Once that truth enters psychology, the old images of loneliness become harder to maintain. If attachment is built partly from contact that soothes, steadies, and allows fear to subside, then one can begin to understand why social life may later fail, even when it remains externally populated. A person may be surrounded and still not feel rested by anyone's presence. They may be fed by a relationship in every practical sense, spoken to, accommodated, included, even cared for in routine ways, and still experience an absence in the more delicate register that attachment research had begun to uncover. The need involved is not theatrical. It is quiet, bodily, and often pre-verbal in origin. It concerns whether another presence can actually regulate distress or whether proximity remains emotionally thin. Harlow's work also sharpened a more unsettling recognition. Fear changes what attachment is under ordinary conditions. One might treat closeness as pleasant or socially desirable. Under threat, its deeper function becomes obvious. The infant, in a strange environment, does not return to the surrogate as a matter of etiquette. It returns because alarm reorganizes the entire field of behavior around the search for safety. In adults, the same principle appears in more complicated forms. Times of stress reveal which relationships are usable inwardly and which are not. Some people can sit beside us and leave our nervous system untouched. Others change the quality of experience simply by being there. That does not mean attachment is nothing more than stress reduction. But it does mean that relationships are partly known through their capacity to help us settle when uncertainty rises. There is something almost embarrassing in how basic this is. Highly modern societies often prefer to imagine adults as self-contained minds, negotiating terms with one another. The attachment tradition, strengthened by experiments like Harlow's, kept returning to a less flattering and more truthful picture. Human beings remain vulnerable to the quality of closeness. They depend, more than they may wish to admit, on forms of comfort that are not reducible to explicit reasoning. One relationship may feel breathable. Another may feel effortful despite constant contact. One environment may allow the self to soften. Another may require continuous self-management. Loneliness begins to look different when seen through that lens. It is no longer just a census of absent people. It becomes a condition in which the available presences do not provide the kind of reassurance the organism is built to seek. And yet, by itself, this laboratory chapter could not solve the whole mystery. Harlow had shown that comfort mattered, that tactile security mattered, that feeding theories were incomplete, and that deprivation could distort development in severe ways. Attachment researchers had shown that children differed in how they used caregivers as secure bases and in how reunion did or did not repair distress. All of that brought psychology closer to the hidden mechanics of closeness. But everyday adult loneliness still had many faces. One person might have a spouse and feel unknown. Another might have loyal friends, yet miss a singular intimacy. Someone else might feel cut off, not because of the loss of one bond, but because life lacked a wider circle of companionship or shared belonging. The science was getting better at identifying the need for comfort, but it still needed clearer language for the different shapes absence could take. That language would begin to emerge when certain thinkers stopped treating loneliness as a vague emotional complaint and started asking whether there might be more than one kind of it. A person could be socially surrounded and still miss a deeper attachment, or they could have one intimate tie and still feel unmoored in the larger world around them. To name those differences would require another turn in the story, away from the laboratory's stark demonstrations and toward the quieter task of describing what exactly is missing when a life contains people, yet still leaves a person alone. What was still missing, even after the great attachment debates and the unforgettable laboratory images of infants reaching for comfort, was language fine enough to describe adult experience without flattening it. People knew the feeling long before science could sort it. They knew the hollowness of a crowded evening, the strange ache of lying beside someone and feeling far away, the fatigue of moving through a social life that looked complete from the outside while remaining inwardly sparse. Yet for a long time, loneliness stayed conceptually blurred. It was treated as sadness, shyness, exclusion, depression, withdrawal, poor adjustment, or simply one more unhappy shade of human feeling. Without clearer distinctions, the phenomenon kept slipping out of view. A person could say, "I feel lonely," and mean several different things at once. Another could deny loneliness altogether while living inside one of its most durable forms. Part of the change began with a psychiatrist who insisted that loneliness deserved to be taken seriously in its own right. In 1959, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann published an essay simply titled Loneliness. She was a formidable figure. Born in Germany in 1889, trained in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, later emigrating to the United States after the rise of Nazism. Her clinical life brought her into close contact with some of the most difficult and isolated forms of human suffering, including patients whose inner worlds had become profoundly estranged from shared reality. She was not approaching loneliness as a fashionable social complaint. To her, it was one of the least satisfyingly conceptualized experiences in psychiatry, and one of the most painful. The striking thing about her essay is its seriousness of tone. She wrote as someone convinced that loneliness had been underestimated precisely because it was so common and so easy to mistake for other states. From Reichmann did not solve the subject all at once. Her writing retained something of the psychoanalytic style of her time, reflective and interpretive rather than statistical. But she helped shift the atmosphere around the topic. Loneliness was no longer merely the background sadness of a neglected patient or the poetic vocabulary of private sorrow. It became something that might deserve its own clinical attention, its own conceptual care. She was especially alert to the paradox that loneliness could occur in the presence of others. A human being might be surrounded and still remain unreachable, unable to experience contact as nourishing. That insight mattered because it kept the science from wandering back into simplistic equations of loneliness with literal aloneness. Something more interior was being named, and it required more precision. The search for that precision unfolded gradually in the decades that followed. By the 1960s and 1970s, loneliness began to attract greater attention from social psychologists, developmental thinkers, gerontologists, and clinicians who wanted something firmer than impressionistic description. This was part of a broader transformation in the behavioral sciences. Researchers were increasingly interested in turning vague categories into measurable constructs, in building scales, distinguishing related but non-identical experiences, and making emotional life more visible to systematic study. The risk, of course, was reduction. To measure a feeling is to simplify it. Yet without some form of simplification, whole regions of experience remain scientifically elusive. Loneliness had hovered too long between literature, common sense, psychiatry, an ordinary complaint. If it was ever going to be studied at scale, it first had to be named with greater care. One of the most important figures in that naming was Robert Weiss. A sociologist and social policy scholar, Weiss published Loneliness, the experience of emotional and social isolation, in 1973. And with that title alone, the field took a decisive step forward. His achievement was not merely to say that loneliness mattered. It was to propose that loneliness comes in at least two distinct forms, and that failing to separate them had produced much of the confusion surrounding the subject. Emotional loneliness, in his account, arises from the absence of a close attachment figure, someone whose presence provides deep reassurance, intimacy, and a sense of being personally held in mind. Social loneliness, by contrast, involves the lack of a broader network of relationships, the absence of companionship, shared belonging, or integration into a wider circle of life. The distinction sounds simple once heard. That is often how major conceptual breakthroughs feel, but its consequences were far-reaching. A person could live with a spouse, speak daily with colleagues, see neighbors, answer messages, attend gatherings, and still suffer emotional loneliness if no relationship carried the weight of true intimacy. Another might have one cherished bond, yet feel socially lonely because life lacked a circle, a community, a stable sense of participation in something larger than the dyad. These forms of absence were not identical, and they could not be cured in the same way. More company might ease one and leave the other untouched. More intimacy might repair one while failing to answer the ache of being unmoored from a wider world. Suddenly the old confusion began to clear. The lonely marriage, the lonely city dweller, the lonely student in a busy dormitory, the lonely elder with visitors but no true confidant. All of these experiences could now be thought about without being collapsed into a single vague category. There is a quiet elegance in Vice's framework because it allows lived experience to become more truthful without becoming more melodramatic. It explains why some forms of social life feel thin even when they are busy. It explains why loneliness can survive contact. It explains why a person might say, "I have people around me," and still feel that something essential is missing, while another might say, "I have one person I truly trust," and yet remain cut off from a wider field of belonging. Most importantly, it shifted the question from mere quantity to structure and quality. Which human ties matter for what? What kind of absence is being suffered? What form of connection is actually missing? Around the same time, other researchers were moving toward a complementary insight from a slightly different angle. Letitia Ann Peplau and Danielle Perlman became central figures in what would later be known as the discrepancy approach to loneliness. Their work did not reject Weiss's distinctions, but it added another conceptual layer. Loneliness, they argued, is not best understood simply as the presence or absence of people. It arises from a discrepancy between the relationships a person desires and the relationships they perceive themselves to have. That gap may concern number, intimacy, reliability, understanding, shared identity, or some combination of these. The key point is that loneliness depends partly on expectation and interpretation. Two lives with outwardly similar social structures may be experienced quite differently because the standards against which they are felt are not the same. This idea gave the science a more dynamic and psychologically nuanced shape. It suggested that loneliness does not live entirely in the objective world, and it does not live entirely in fantasy either. It emerges in the tension between outer reality and inner need. A person may have fewer relationships than another and feel content because those ties are sufficient by their own standards. Another may have many contacts and remain painfully lonely because none of them meet the kind of mutuality, depth, or reliability they long for. The discrepancy model was especially valuable for the documentary's central paradox. It made clear why being around people is not decisive. The question is whether the available relationships answer the kind of connection the mind is seeking. If they do not, presence can intensify the ache rather than relieve it, because the contrast between apparent abundance and felt deprivation becomes sharper. Once those distinctions entered the field, loneliness began to look less like an undifferentiated emotional fog and more like a structure with contours. Researchers could ask more precise questions. Was a person missing intimacy, or community, or both? Had their expectations shifted because of grief, migration, divorce, illness, institutional life, aging, disability, or a broader change in social world? Were they lonely because no one was there, or because the people there could not be used inwardly as sources of understanding and steadiness? The vocabulary did not remove pain, but it did make the pain more legible. To name an experience accurately is sometimes the first real form of relief. Even when no cure is immediately available, clearer language can end a certain kind of confusion. Science, of course, wanted more than eloquent distinctions. It wanted instruments. If loneliness was to be studied across large populations, compared across groups, tracked over time, and linked to health, cognition, or social circumstances, researchers needed ways to measure it. That effort produced some of the best-known tools in the field, including the UCLA Loneliness Scale, first developed in the late 1970s and later revised. Here again, there was a delicate balance to strike. Ask too directly, "Are you lonely?" And people may answer through shame, defensiveness, or cultural scripts about what loneliness means. Ask more indirectly about feeling left out, isolated from others, or lacking companionship, and a subtler picture may emerge. The scale was designed to capture the subjective experience without relying only on a single blunt label. This was more consequential than it may first appear. Measurement does not simply record a reality that was already obvious. It shapes what can be noticed. Once loneliness could be quantified with some reliability, it entered new domains of research. It could be studied among older adults, adolescents, college students, people living alone, people living with families, migrants, widows, workers, prisoners, patients, and whole national samples. It became possible to ask how loneliness differed from depression, how it related to social support, how often it appeared without objective isolation, and whether distinct forms of loneliness behaved differently across the life course. The field was still far from a final answer, but the invisible had become more visible. Researchers no longer had to infer everything from clinical intuition or literary recognition alone. Even so, the effort to measure loneliness exposed the difficulty of the subject rather than resolving it. Some scales emphasized social dissatisfaction. Others leaned more toward perceived isolation. Some researchers preferred global measures. Others argued that emotional and social loneliness should be separated explicitly. Dutch researcher Jenny de Jong-Gierveld, for example, helped develop approaches that distinguished those components more carefully, especially in the study of aging and changing social networks. The existence of multiple tools was itself revealing. Loneliness was not a single smooth quantity waiting to be read off like body temperature. It was a layered experience, with overlapping meanings, cultural variations, and different social triggers. The measurement revolution advanced the science, but it also kept reminding the field that subjective life resists simple containment. The richer the research became, the more one could see why loneliness had been so hard to classify in the first place. It sits at the crossroads of attachment, expectation, social structure, loss, and self-understanding. It can be acute or chronic. It can follow bereavement, relocation, divorce, exclusion, illness, institutional change, or the slow erosion of everyday intimacy. It may flare in adolescence, in the first year after moving away, in old age after the deaths of peers, or in the middle of stable adulthood when life becomes crowded with obligation and strangely sparse in emotional reciprocity. Some people experience it as emptiness. Others feel restlessness, numbness, embarrassment, resentment, or the exhausting sense of having to perform social ease while inwardly unconvinced. Once the science gave loneliness more than one name, these differences stopped looking like mere noise. They began to look like clues. There was also a philosophical consequence to all of this. If loneliness is shaped by discrepancy and by distinct kinds of relational absence, then it cannot be reduced to sheer social failure in the bluntest sense. A person may be objectively embedded in networks and still carry a severe deficit in the particular form of contact they need. Another may be objectively isolated and yet less lonely than expected because solitude fits their disposition, or because one distant but trusted bond continues to anchor them. The subjective dimension here is not a weakness in the science. It is part of the phenomenon itself. Human beings do not merely occupy relationships. They interpret them. They ask, often beneath conscious language, whether these relationships are enough, whether they are safe, whether they allow the self to be real, whether they offer return when distress rises. Loneliness appears where the answer falters. This changed the cultural meaning of the subject as well. Loneliness could no longer be dismissed quite so easily as the plight of the obviously isolated, the socially marginal, or the visibly abandoned. It became possible to see it in ordinary interiors of modern life. In the partner who is listened to, but not understood. In the student surrounded by peers yet unable to confide. In the recently retired person whose days are full of contact, but empty of shared purpose. In the friend group where conversation never crosses certain emotional thresholds. In the family where practical concern is abundant while warmth remains strangely intermittent. These are not theatrical situations. That is precisely why the new concepts mattered. They gave quiet suffering a sharper outline. And yet, the more clearly loneliness was described, the more another mystery began to gather around it. Why did some people remain trapped in it even when opportunities for connection existed? Why did loneliness sometimes seem to change perception itself, making the social world feel more difficult to trust, more effortful to enter, more likely to wound? Clinicians and researchers could now distinguish emotional loneliness from social loneliness, and they could describe the painful gap between desired and actual relationships. But naming the forms of absence did not yet explain how the lonely mind moves through daily life. It did not fully explain why some people, once lonely, seemed to become more vigilant, more guarded, more sensitive to slights or ambiguity, as though the state itself were altering the way other human beings were seen. That question pointed beyond classification toward mechanism. If loneliness is more than a description of what is missing, perhaps it is also a condition that reorganizes attention, expectation, and interpretation while it lasts. Perhaps the person in the crowded room is not only lacking connection, but perceiving the room through a state of heightened social uncertainty. By the late 20th century and into the early 21st, that possibility would begin drawing psychologists and neuroscientists toward a deeper claim that loneliness is not just a sorrowful commentary on life, but a signal state that can change how the mind reads the presence of others. If classification brought clarity, it also exposed a deeper mystery. Once researchers had better names for emotional loneliness, social loneliness, and the painful discrepancy between desired and actual connection, another question pressed forward. Why did loneliness sometimes seem to persist, even when opportunities for contact remained available? Why did it so often carry with it a shift in atmosphere, a heightened sensitivity, a quickness to detect coolness, hesitation, ambiguity, or rejection? It was as though the feeling did not merely describe a social lack. It seemed to change the way the social world itself was being perceived. You can sense that alteration in ordinary life before you ever encounter a study about it. A person who has been lonely for a long time may enter a room already braced. They may notice who fails to look up, who turns away first, whose warmth feels automatic, and whose feels faintly procedural. An unanswered message may land with more force than it would have at another moment. A neutral expression may appear dismissive. A delayed invitation may seem loaded with meaning. None of this has to be melodramatic. Much of it happens below the level of articulated thought. The mind becomes slightly more watchful, more interpretive, less willing to relax into ambiguity, and once that state takes hold, connection itself can become harder to trust. By the late 20th century, psychology was becoming more interested in exactly these feedback loops between feeling, perception, and physiology. Researchers no longer wanted only to describe loneliness from the outside or correlate it with obvious social conditions. They wanted to know what kind of state it was. Was loneliness merely the subjective report that one lacked sufficient connection? Or did it function more like a biological signal? Something with consequences for attention, expectation, behavior, and even bodily systems beyond conscious mood. This question would draw together social psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary reasoning, psychophysiology, and health research in a way that earlier generations could only have guessed at. One of the central figures in that shift was John Cacioppo, born in 1951, trained as a psychologist, and later based at the University of Chicago. Cacioppo became one of the founders of social neuroscience, a field shaped by the conviction that social experience is not an optional overlay on human biology, but one of the environments through which biology itself is regulated. He was interested in how relationships, emotions, isolation, and social perception leave traces in the body and brain. Loneliness, in his hands, ceased to look like a soft topic at the edges of serious science. It became a way into some of the most fundamental questions about what human beings are built to need from one another. Cacioppo's approach was distinctive because it refused a false choice. He did not treat loneliness as either a poetic feeling or a set of biological measurements, as though one had to replace the other. Instead, he asked how a subjective experience could have objective consequences. If loneliness is painful, what is that pain for? Why would evolution allow such a state to exist? Why would perceived social isolation matter so much to a species whose survival has long depended on groups, alliances, mutual defense, cooperative child-rearing, and the transmission of knowledge across generations? His answer, developed across many studies and reviews, was both simple and unsettling. Loneliness may function as an alarm signal, an aversive state that evolved to draw attention to the risk of social disconnection. Much as hunger draws attention to nutritional need or pain draws attention to bodily harm. The elegance of that proposal lies in what it explains. If loneliness is merely a sad thought about one's circumstances, then its intensity can seem disproportionate. But if it is a signal state shaped by the history of a social species, then its urgency makes more sense. To become disconnected from protective relationships could once have been dangerous in a literal way. The solitary organism is more exposed to predators, to resource scarcity, to injury, to the loss of shared vigilance. In such a framework, loneliness is not simply sentimental. It is adaptive in the short term because it pushes the individual to seek renewed connection. The pain has a function. It orients attention toward a social deficit that matters. Yet the very feature that may make loneliness adaptive in brief episodes also helps explain why it becomes so destructive when prolonged. Alarm states do not merely inform, they reorganize. Hunger changes what food means in the environment. Physical pain changes how the body is moved and guarded. In a similar way, chronic loneliness may change how other people are seen. Cacioppo and colleagues argued that perceived social isolation heightens attention to social threat. The lonely mind becomes more vigilant for signs that it is unwelcome, excluded, ignored, or judged. This does not mean lonely individuals hallucinate hostility where none exists. The claim is subtler, under sustained disconnection. Ambiguous social cues may be processed with greater suspicion, and attention may be drawn more readily to danger than to reassurance. That idea matters because it transforms loneliness from a static condition into a loop. The person feels disconnected, and that state sharpens threat monitoring. Heightened monitoring makes social interaction more effortful and often more defensive. Defensive behavior can subtly alter how others respond. Wariness may appear distant. Overinterpretation may create tension. Withdrawal may reduce opportunities for warmth to accumulate. The next interaction then enters an already primed system, confirming the feeling that connection is hard to reach. Loneliness, in this view, does not simply reflect a lack of relationship. It can become a mode of social perception that keeps the lack in place, even when potential pathways outward still exist. There was empirical support for this picture from several directions. Experimental work suggested that people high in loneliness can show stronger attention to negative social information and greater sensitivity to cues of rejection or exclusion. Other studies linked loneliness to sleep fragmentation, altered stress physiology, depressive symptoms, and immune-related processes. Though the precise pathways remain complex and not reducible to a single mechanism, what gave the field its particular force was not one spectacular finding, but the accumulation of evidence that loneliness was associated with patterns of vigilance and strain rather than mere passivity. The lonely person was not simply missing people. Often, they were enduring a state of guardedness. Neuroscience, too, entered the picture, although here the story requires some care. Early 21st century enthusiasm sometimes made it sound as though brain imaging could settle every psychological question by pointing to illuminated regions on a scan. Reality was never so neat. Still, certain studies helped popularize a compelling idea. Social pain and physical pain appear to overlap in meaningful ways. Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues, for example, used paradigms involving social exclusion to show activation in brain areas associated with the affective component of pain. The public fascination was immediate. Rejection hurts. Exclusion hurts. The phrase sounds metaphorical in everyday speech, but the brain seemed to treat it with surprising seriousness. The most widely known experimental tool in that area was deceptively simple. Participants believed they were playing a ball-tossing game with others over a computer network, only to find themselves gradually excluded from the exchange. The paradigm, often called cyberball, became influential because it distilled something familiar into a controlled form. Being left out of a tiny social pattern, even by strangers in an artificial setting, could alter mood, self-reported belonging, and neural responses. Again, the scientific value here was not that an online ball game reproduced the whole of loneliness. It did not. Rather, it showed that exclusion, even mild and brief, could register quickly and meaningfully in human experience. Later debate has made the picture more nuanced. Social pain and physical pain are not identical, and the degree of overlap in neural systems should not be exaggerated. Brain regions are rarely as one purpose as headlines suggest. Researchers have argued over interpretation, specificity, and the temptation to oversimplify imaging data into tidy slogans. That debate is healthy. It reminds us that good science grows more precise by revising its own early enthusiasm. But even after the simplifications are stripped away, something important remains. Human beings respond to exclusion and disconnection with remarkable immediacy. and the experience recruits systems involved in distress, vigilance, and salience. The mind treats social injury as consequential. Cacioppo's work helped gather these strands into a larger theoretical picture. Perceived social isolation, he argued, places the individual into a self-preservative mode. In that mode, short-term self-protection becomes more prominent. Attention bends toward threat. Trust becomes harder to extend. The person may behave in ways that are entirely understandable from the inside, and yet costly from the outside. They may disclose less, expect less, or interpret uncertainty pessimistically. The tragedy is that the very adaptations that protect against immediate hurt may also obstruct the rebuilding of connection. To avoid being wounded again, the lonely mind narrows. But narrowing can make it harder for warmth to be recognized when it appears. This helps explain why the experience of loneliness can feel so strangely bodily, even when nothing dramatic is happening in the external scene. In a gathering, one may feel tense without knowing exactly why. After a conversation, one may replay details, searching for signs of indifference in a new relationship. One may crave reassurance while also doubting it. None of that requires conscious theory. The state itself does much of the work. A system on alert does not wait for definitive proof before adjusting its posture. It leans forward. It scans. It reads more into partial cues than a relaxed system would. And because social life is full of ambiguity, there is always more material to scan. Here, the distinction between objective isolation and subjective loneliness becomes even more important. Two people can occupy similar social environments and respond very differently because the relevant variable is not just external structure, but felt security. One person may attend a busy workplace and find it mildly stimulating, even supportive. Another may move through the same environment in a constant state of social uncertainty, interpreting each small interaction through the question of whether they are accepted, forgotten, tolerated, or misplaced. The second person is not merely thinking negatively. They may be inhabiting a state of heightened vigilance shaped by history, context, and the current pain of disconnection. Once loneliness is understood as a signal state, the persistence of the feeling in crowded places becomes less paradoxical. Crowds do not automatically calm an alarmed system. Sometimes they feed it. This also helps illuminate why simple advice so often fails. Get out more. Meet people. Join a group. Such suggestions are not always wrong. Social opportunity matters. Yet, if loneliness has already altered how the social field is processed, then increasing exposure without addressing vigilance may leave a person exhausted rather than restored. More interaction is not always more connection. Under some conditions, it simply produces more occasions for uncertainty. A room full of strangers may intensify self-monitoring. A casual conversation may heighten awareness of awkwardness rather than soothe it. The person then returns home, not less lonely, but confirmed in the suspicion that company changes nothing. Researchers interested in loneliness also began examining how it behaves across networks. One intriguing line of work suggested that loneliness clusters in social groups and may spread through patterns of relation. The claim here is not mystical. It is that moods, expectations, withdrawal patterns, and social positioning can shape others over time. People at the edges of networks may become lonelier. Lonely individuals may find it harder to maintain ties. Their altered behavior may influence the responses they receive, which in turn affects the structure around them. Even without treating the findings too dramatically, the image is powerful. Loneliness is not only a private ache sealed inside one person. It can alter relational systems around that person, sometimes reinforcing the very isolation that produced it. The social neuroscience turn, therefore, changed the meaning of the topic in a profound way. Loneliness was no longer just an after effect of a deficient social life. It was a condition that could actively shape cognition, emotion, and behavior while it lasted. This did not erase the importance of society, history, or development. All the earlier layers remain. Durkheim still matters. Bowlby still matters. Weiss still matters. But now another dimension had entered the frame. The mind itself is not a neutral observer of its own disconnection. It responds. It adapts. It protects. And in protecting, it may help prolong the very state from which it is trying to escape. There is something both compassionate and sobering in that realization. Compassionate, because it explains why loneliness is not simply cured by willpower or by the command to be more socially active. Sobering, because it means the condition can become self-reinforcing in ways that are hard to perceive from within. The person longing for closeness may simultaneously be bracing against it. They may be seeking another mind and defending themselves from disappointment at the same time. That inner split is one reason lonely people can appear contradictory, craving intimacy, then withdrawing, wanting reassurance, then distrusting it, entering a room hoping to connect, then leaving more certain than before that connection is unavailable. The contradiction is real, but it is not irrational. It belongs to the structure of alarm. And still, even this account does not answer everything. It tells us why loneliness can persist, why it can distort interpretation, and why the presence of others may fail to switch off the signal. But it leaves open a very practical question, one that returns us to the ordinary world with new eyes. If the social mind can remain unconsoled even when people are near, then what kinds of presence actually count as protective? Why do some relationships, communities, workplaces, families, and digital networks leave people feeling more held, while others seem to increase the sense of distance despite constant contact? In other words, if loneliness is partly about how the mind reads the available social world, why does more social world so often fail to become more belonging? That question brings us back out of the laboratory and the scanner, away from the controlled exclusions and measured responses, and into the ordinary arrangements of modern life, into offices where people spend whole days in one another's sight, into apartment buildings where hundreds sleep within a few walls of one another and barely exchange a word, into friendships sustained by constant messages and yet somehow starved of depth, into marriages that remain stable in form while growing thin in feeling, into schools, churches, gyms, group chats, family tables, commuter trains, and crowded cafes. Everywhere, the same quiet contradiction waits. Human contact is abundant. Belonging is not. By this point in the story, that contradiction no longer looks accidental. We already know that loneliness is not simply the same thing as being objectively isolated. We know that attachment history shapes what presence feels like, and that loneliness can become a state of vigilance rather than a mere description of one's circumstances. But there is still another layer to understand. The modern world often assumes that more access to other people should reliably reduce loneliness. More networks, more opportunities, more contact, more communication. Yet the evidence has never aligned neatly with that assumption. Again and again, researchers found that the size of a person's network does not map perfectly onto the feeling of connection. A life full of contact can remain emotionally poor. A smaller life can sometimes feel richly held. This is one reason loneliness has proven so stubborn in societies that are, by many measures, densely connected. Contact is easier to produce than trust. Visibility is easier to produce than recognition. Inclusion in an event is easier to produce than the feeling of being known there. A person can be continually reachable and still lack the rare sense that another mind is truly available in return. That difference is subtle until it is felt. Then it becomes unmistakable. There are relationships that leave the self braced, and relationships in whose presence the self can finally stop bracing. From the outside, both may look socially adequate. From the inside, they are worlds apart. An especially illuminating way of thinking about this emerged through what came to be called social baseline theory. Associated most prominently with the psychologist James Cone and his colleagues, the theory offers a quietly radical suggestion. Human beings, it argues, may not be designed to treat the self as an isolated unit that must regulate everything alone. The brain appears to assume, under ordinary conditions, that access to other people is part of the basic environment in which effort, danger, and emotion are managed. In that sense, social support is not an optional bonus layered on top of a self-sufficient organism. It may be part of the baseline condition under which the organism expects to function most efficiently. The implications of that are far-reaching. If the mind assumes the availability of dependable others as part of its normal operating conditions, then the mere presence of bodies nearby is not enough. The relevant question becomes whether those others are actually usable as support. Are they trusted? Are they responsive? Do they reduce uncertainty or increase it? Can the nervous system include them in its own calculations? Or must it continue to manage everything alone? This helps explain why one person sitting quietly beside us can change the whole texture of a difficult moment, while an entire crowded room may do nothing at all. It is not social quantity by itself that matters. It is whether the relationship is encoded as real support. Some of the work that made this idea vivid came through deceptively simple experiments involving hand-holding under threat. Participants anticipating mild electric shock often showed reduced neural responses to threat when holding the hand of a spouse, particularly a spouse whose support they experienced as dependable, compared with being alone or holding the hand of a stranger. The experimental details matter, but the emotional logic matters more. Certain relationships are not simply comforting in a sentimental sense. They alter how burden, fear, and effort are distributed. Another person can become part of the way the brain manages difficulty. Seen from this angle, loneliness around people begins to look even clearer. If the mind does not code those people as safe, steady, or emotionally available, then their presence does not enter the system as relief. It remains external. This also helps explain why some forms of social life feel curiously exhausting. There are environments in which one is constantly among others and yet continuously self-managing. The body never fully hands anything over. Every interaction requires calibration. Tone must be monitored. Distance must be judged. Disclosure must be rationed. One remains socially active but internally unshared. Such a life may produce the appearance of connection while withholding one of its most important functions, the reduction of solitary effort. Belonging, in that deeper sense, means that another presence helps carry the emotional and cognitive load of being alive. Without that, even abundant company can leave a person tired and inwardly alone. Relationships themselves can fail in different ways. Some offer reliability without depth. A person may be surrounded by kind, decent people who show up, reply, remember birthdays, and perform all the recognizable gestures of care, yet never quite create the conditions in which one feels understood. Other relationships offer bursts of intensity without steadiness. They feel intimate in flashes and then vanish into inconsistency, leaving the nervous system more alert than soothed. Some social worlds produce constant interaction around tasks, obligations, or entertainment while carefully avoiding emotional truth. In such settings, loneliness can become almost harder to name because nothing is overtly wrong. One is not excluded. One is simply never fully met. Marriage and partnership have always revealed this with particular clarity. Social imagination tends to treat couplehood as an antidote to loneliness, as though proximity plus commitment should reliably solve the problem. But clinicians and researchers have long known that some of the most painful loneliness happens inside intimate relationships. A partner may be physically present, practically cooperative, even loyal in outward terms, and still remain emotionally unreachable. Conversation continues, but it stays on the surface. Distress is acknowledged without being truly received. Comfort is offered in forms that miss the actual need. Over time, the relationship remains visible to the outside world, while the private experience within it thins. To be lonely alone is painful. To be lonely beside someone who is supposed to know you can be even more disorienting, because the social symbol of connection remains intact while the felt reality fades. The same is true of friendship circles and communities. A person may belong to a group in the obvious sense, invited, included, tagged in photographs, present at gatherings, and still feel no secure place inside its emotional structure. Groups often run on roles. The funny one, the calm one, the useful one, the dependable one, the agreeable one. Such roles create participation, but not necessarily mutual knowledge. A person can be warmly welcomed in the version of themselves a group has learned to expect, while feeling invisible in more vulnerable parts of their inner life. Belonging then becomes conditional in a way that is hard to admit even to oneself. You are included, but only in a narrowed form. You are present, but not fully available to be known. Cultural research adds another layer of complexity. As loneliness studies expanded across countries and populations, it became increasingly clear that belonging is shaped by more than individual psychology. Norms about independence, family obligation, emotional expression, privacy, and interdependence all change the meaning of connection. In some more individualistic societies, people may enjoy greater freedom to choose relationships and define themselves apart from tradition, yet also face weaker default structures of communal support. In more collectivistic settings, there may be stronger built-in social integration and family ties, but also pressures, hierarchies, or emotional constraints that complicate the picture. The result is not a simple ranking in which one kind of culture is lonely and the other is not. Rather, the standards by which social life feels sufficient are themselves culturally shaped. This is why cross-cultural loneliness research can appear contradictory at first glance. Some findings suggest that societies organized around individualism show higher loneliness overall. Others reveal that the relationship is more tangled, depending on age, gender, expectations, inequality, and social trust. A person may have many relatives nearby and still feel emotionally isolated if intimacy is discouraged. Another may live with greater physical independence and yet feel less lonely because chosen relationships are more openly confiding. Culture does not cancel the basic human need for belonging, but it changes how belonging is built, displayed, expected, and judged. It also changes what counts as a painful discrepancy. The same social arrangement may feel adequate in one setting and impoverished in another because the imagined standard differs. Trust, perhaps more than any single variable, keeps returning at the center of these differences. A person can endure limited contact more easily when they trust its depth than when they distrust an abundance of shallow contact. Whole societies also vary in generalized trust. The background expectation that others are relatively reliable, fair, and mutually oriented rather than threatening or exploitative, that wider climate affects loneliness in ways that are easy to miss. When trust is low, every interaction demands more caution. Social life becomes effortful at scale. One may be surrounded by people and still feel that none of the surrounding structure is relaxed enough to carry one's weight. Belonging requires not only other people, but a social atmosphere in which dependence does not constantly feel dangerous. The digital world complicated all of this further. By the early 21st century, it had become possible to remain in near constant contact with others through texts, feeds, platforms, video calls, and online communities. For some observers, this looked like a solution to loneliness. For others, it looked like its intensification. The truth, as so often, turned out to be less clean. Online life has clearly offered real connection in many cases. It has allowed migrants to sustain distant ties, isolated individuals to find affinity, marginalized people to encounter others who share otherwise hidden experiences, and friendships to persist across long stretches of physical separation. It would be false to portray digital connection as mere counterfeit. And yet digital life often magnifies the distinction between visibility and intimacy. One can be watched, followed, reacted to, and constantly updated on without being deeply known. One can maintain a steady stream of low-grade contact that creates the appearance of social fullness while leaving little room for unguarded, sustained exchange. Platforms reward availability, responsiveness, and presentation. They do not always reward vulnerability, patience, or the slow accumulation of trust. Social comparison also becomes harder to escape. Other people's closeness appears continuously in image form. Dinners, weddings, friend groups, family rituals, celebrations, private jokes rendered public, and the lonely mind, already prone to vigilance, may read those displays less as information than as evidence of exclusion. This is part of why the question, does social media cause loneliness, has resisted simple answers. In some people, certain uses intensify comparison, fragmentation, distraction, and the sense of being perpetually connected, yet emotionally unfed. In others, online communication meaningfully reduces isolation. Often the same person experiences both. The deeper issue is not whether technology is social or antisocial in the abstract. It is whether the forms of connection it provides become psychologically usable as belonging. Can one rest in them? Can one turn to them under stress and feel genuinely answered? Do they thicken relationship? Or do they mostly increase awareness of one's own peripheral place in other people's lives? The modern workplace offers another version of the same puzzle. Many people spend more waking hours among coworkers than among family or close friends. Yet workplaces are typically organized around performance, coordination, and role clarity rather than emotional refuge. Some become real communities over time. Many do not. They generate interaction without necessarily generating security. One may be appreciated for competence, valued for efficiency, even liked in everyday ways, and still feel profoundly alone in moments that matter. When institutions depend on human presence while narrowing what kinds of presence are welcome, loneliness flourishes quietly. The person is integrated functionally and adrift personally. Seen from all these angles, the phrase "more people" begins to lose its persuasive power. More people can mean more witnesses, more interactions, more roles, more messages, more ambient contact, more opportunities for comparison, more occasions to perform ease, more chances to feel peripheral. It can also, of course, mean more support, but only when some portion of that contact becomes dependable enough to be used inwardly. That is the thread running through marriage, friendship, culture, work, and technology alike. Human beings are not simply counting heads. They are asking, often below language, whether the social world they inhabit is breathable, whether it can be leaned on, whether it grants not just participation, but rest. This is why belonging is such a demanding word. It does not mean being merely present in the same place. It does not mean being tolerated, tracked, or periodically included. It implies a fit between self and world, between vulnerability and response, between expression and reception. Belonging lets a person stop translating themselves quite so much. It reduces the labor of being with others. It gives back some sense that one's inner life has a place to land. Where that feeling is absent, loneliness can survive almost any amount of contact. In fact, contact may intensify the absence by repeatedly displaying the shape of what should comfort while failing to provide it. By now, the scientific picture is much richer than the old stereotype of loneliness as simple solitude. The research has moved through society, childhood, attachment, comfort, measurement, threat, trust, and the structures of modern life. It has shown why contact and connection can come apart, why crowds do not always soothe, and why the lonely mind may struggle to use available relationships as shelter. Yet even after all of that, something remains unfinished. We know more than earlier generations knew. We can describe the mechanisms with greater precision. We can see why easy solutions fail. But the subject has not resolved into a final answer. The more clearly science has illuminated loneliness, the more it has revealed how difficult belonging is to build, maintain, and repair. That unfinished quality matters, because the last movement of this story cannot honestly pretend the mystery is solved. What science has given is not a simple cure, but a better map of the territory, clear enough to change how we see ourselves, one another, and the social world we keep trying to inhabit. And from there, one final question remains. After all the classifications, experiments, and theories, what can we truly say with confidence about loneliness now? And what still lies beyond the edge of our understanding? And so, after all the distinctions, studies, observational rooms, laboratory surrogates, surveys, and scans, we arrive at a place that is at once clearer and less tidy than earlier generations might have hoped. Loneliness has not turned out to be a simple defect in social quantity. It is not exhausted by the image of a person with no one around them. It cannot be fully captured by head counts, household size, message frequency, or the visible density of a life. Science has illuminated a great deal, but what it has illuminated most of all is the complexity of the need itself. Human beings do not merely require contact, They require forms of presence that can be trusted, used inwardly, and felt as real enough to quiet some part of the mind's uncertainty. That recognition has changed the status of loneliness in modern thought. What once hovered between poetry, private sorrow, and moral commentary has, over time, moved into epidemiology, developmental psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, and public health. In recent years, major health institutions have spoken about social connection with an urgency that would have seemed surprising not so long ago. Loneliness is no longer treated only as a personal sadness that individuals should somehow solve by trying harder, being more cheerful, or filling their calendars. It has entered a wider conversation about health, aging, community design, work, technology, education, and the structures through which everyday life either supports human attachment or gradually thins it. Part of what drove that change was the accumulation of evidence linking loneliness and social isolation to many domains of well-being. Researchers began finding associations with depression, anxiety, sleep disturbance, cardiovascular strain, poor health behaviors, cognitive decline in some contexts, and all-cause mortality risk in broad population studies. The details vary, and not every pathway is equally settled, but the overall picture became difficult to dismiss. A person's social world is not a decorative feature of life, a pleasant extra added on after the real biology has done its work. The human organism seems to register connection and disconnection deeply. The body keeps some record of how held or unheld a life has become. Still, the science has had to learn caution as well as confidence. Public discussion often flattens the subject too quickly. One study becomes a slogan. One brain image becomes a claim that loneliness is the same as physical pain. One epidemiological pattern becomes a headline suggesting that the matter is already understood in full. But careful researchers have repeatedly had to slow the story down. Loneliness and social isolation overlap, yet they are not interchangeable. Their health effects can differ. Their causes can differ. A person may be objectively isolated and not especially lonely. Another may be socially busy and profoundly alone. Even within the health literature, some findings are more robust than others. Strong associations do not automatically reveal clean causal chains. Lives are complicated. Illness can increase loneliness, and loneliness can worsen illness. Vulnerability moves in more than one direction. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the field. In some ways, it is one of the most intellectually honest features of the subject. Loneliness sits where multiple sciences meet, and each discipline sees something real while missing something else. Sociology reveals how modern forms of life can leave people insufficiently integrated. Developmental psychology shows how early bonds shape the felt meaning of closeness. Experimental work demonstrates that comfort and regulation matter more than old feeding theories allowed. Social psychology clarifies the discrepancy between desired and actual relationships. Neuroscience and psychophysiology suggest that prolonged disconnection can shift attention, vigilance, and bodily stress. Public health identifies broad patterns across populations. None of these accounts is the whole truth on its own. Together, they offer something better than a single answer. They offer a layered map. That map helps us say some things with reasonable confidence. We can say that being around people is not, by itself, the same as being socially nourished. We can say that the mind appears to care less about sheer contact than about the quality, dependability, and emotional usability of that contact. We can say that loneliness often grows where there is a gap between presence and attunement, between proximity and trust. between social form and inward security. We can say that certain relationships help regulate distress, while others leave distress fundamentally untouched. We can say that chronic loneliness may become self-reinforcing by changing how the world is perceived, making it harder to recognize safety when it appears. These are not small findings. They significantly alter how we understand the human condition. But there are also things the science still struggles to resolve. One of them is intervention. If loneliness were simply the result of too few interactions, the remedy would be obvious. Increase contact, create more opportunities, expand social networks. Yet decades of intervention research have shown that this approach often helps less than one might expect. People can be placed in groups and remain lonely. They can join classes, communities, or activities and still return home feeling untouched in the deeper sense. Sometimes the intervention does not fail because social contact is irrelevant, but because the contact does not address the actual form of absence involved. A person missing one emotionally significant bond may not be helped much by casual companionship. Someone trapped in threat-focused vigilance may find more interaction overstimulating rather than relieving. Someone living in a socially distrustful environment may need more than invitation. They may need conditions under which trust can slowly become plausible again. This is why some researchers have argued that the most promising approaches do not focus only on increasing the number of relationships. They also attend to interpretation, expectation, attachment patterns, and the kinds of distorted social cognition that can grow under chronic loneliness. In some cases, therapy may matter because it creates a relationship structured around reliability and understanding. In others, community-level changes may matter more, spaces that allow repeated contact, shared purpose, and slowly accumulated familiarity rather than brief or transactional interaction. There is no single cure because there is no single loneliness. The science has moved away from magical thinking here. It no longer assumes that one social prescription fits every form of disconnection. This has moral implications too, though they are easy to miss. If loneliness is shaped partly by social design, then it cannot be treated only as an individual failure to cope. Cities, workplaces, schools, digital systems, housing arrangements, transportation patterns, migration, family policies, and economic precarity all influence how much time, safety, and continuity people have for relationship. A life built around constant movement, performance, and exhaustion may leave little room for the slower forms of attention from which belonging grows. The person who feels lonely in such a world may be told to become more socially active, when what they are really encountering is a structure that erodes the possibility of unpressured connection. Science does not erase personal agency, but it does distribute responsibility more honestly across the environments in which people live. At the same time, loneliness cannot be explained away by structure alone. Two people can inhabit the same social world and experience it very differently. One finds real companionship where another feels only strain. One trusts what another cannot quite trust. One is able to use available closeness as refuge, while another remains inwardly unconsoled by the same kind of contact. This is where the earlier layers of the story remain indispensable. History matters. Development matters. Temperament matters. Loss matters. The present moment matters too. Loneliness does not descend from one single cause. It gathers at the intersection of personal history and social form, of expectation and experience, of the available world and the world as the mind has learned to receive it. That, perhaps, is why the subject remains so difficult to discuss without slipping into either sentimentality or abstraction. Speak too loosely, and loneliness becomes a vague emotional mood that applies to everything and therefore explains nothing. Speak too clinically, and the living texture disappears. The strange late evening ache in a full house, the feeling of speaking and not landing, the effort of staying socially competent while inwardly unconvinced, the oddly bodily relief that arrives when one trusted person sits beside you and the entire emotional climate changes. None of those things is captured fully by statistics alone. Yet without the statistics, the scale of the phenomenon remains hidden. Science has had to learn a kind of double vision here. To preserve measurable clarity without losing the intimate reality from which the questions arose in the first place. There is also the question of shame, which hovers around loneliness more persistently than around many other kinds of suffering. People often feel embarrassed by it, as though the experience were evidence of social incompetence or personal deficiency. That shame is one reason loneliness hides so effectively inside outwardly ordinary lives. It can be easier to confess exhaustion, busyness, even sadness, than to admit that the people around you are not reaching some essential part of you, or that you cannot quite let them. Better language has helped a little. Once loneliness is understood as a complex signal rather than a humiliating confession, some of the self-condemnation may soften, but the shame does not disappear. Human beings continue to feel that connection should come naturally, that if it does not, something must be wrong with them. The science suggests a gentler view. Connection is natural. Yes, but only in the sense that the need for it is natural. Achieving it is often fragile, contingent, and shaped by forces far larger than a single moment of effort. In that light, the central paradox of this documentary looks less like a contradiction and more like a diagnosis. You can feel lonely around people because the need at stake was never mere proximity. It was always something more exacting. The need to feel that another presence can be relied upon emotionally. The need to feel seen without constant self-translation. The need for some degree of mutual reality between inner lives. When that is absent, crowds do not cure the ache. Under certain conditions, they intensify it by providing the shape of connection without its substance. The room is full. The life is busy. The messages arrive, and still the mind remains on the outside of its own social world, searching for a landing place that feels steady enough to count. There is a temptation, at this point, to ask for a final solution, one last theory that would reduce all of this to a single principle. But perhaps the most truthful contribution of the field is that it resists that temptation. Loneliness appears to be one of those experiences that cannot be understood from only one altitude, from far away. It is a public health matter, a feature of changing societies and social systems. From closer in, it is about attachment, expectation, and the interpretation of other minds. At the most intimate scale, it is felt in moments, in the sentence that goes unanswered inwardly, in the conversation after which one still feels alone, in the rare interaction that quiets something almost immediately because another person has finally become psychologically real in the right way. To understand loneliness fully, one must keep moving between those scales without pretending they collapse into one another perfectly. That unfinishedness is not only methodological, it belongs to the human subject itself. Belonging is difficult because people are difficult for one another. They change, disappoint, misunderstand, withdraw, protect themselves, become distracted, become wounded, become afraid. Entire social worlds can normalize forms of interaction that are efficient yet emotionally thin. Some lives become so crowded with labor or strain that intimacy is repeatedly deferred. And even where love is present, it can fail in timing, language, or consistency. Science can reveal patterns in all of this, but it cannot eliminate the vulnerability built into being a creature who depends on other minds for orientation and rest. Still, that vulnerability may be the most important thing this history has taught us to take seriously. Loneliness is painful precisely because human beings are formed for connection in a deep and demanding sense. The pain is not proof that the need is excessive. It is evidence that the need is real. Earlier eras sometimes moralized loneliness, mocked it, or romanticized it. Modern science, at its best, has done something more useful. It has shown that the ache contains information. It says something about the fit between self and world, about what kinds of relationships are present, about whether the social environment is being experienced as usable shelter or merely as background noise. That does not make the pain noble, and it does not make it easy, but it does rescue it from triviality. So the answer, if we can call it that, is both more modest and more profound than a slogan. You may feel lonely around people because human beings do not live by proximity alone. They live by trust, attunement, continuity, and the sense that their inner experience can cross into the life of another and be received there. When those conditions are weak, inconsistent, or absent, company may remain external to the deeper system that registers safety and belonging. The body stays on alert. The mind keeps scanning. Social life continues, but it does not quite become home. And maybe that is where the scientific story finally returns to ordinary life. Not to solve it neatly, but to let it be seen more clearly. The crowded room from the beginning of this documentary is still there. The voices, the laughter, the screens glowing softly in people's hands, the practiced ease of social presence, all of that remains. What has changed is our understanding of what may be happening beneath it. We know now that loneliness can live in spaces that seem full. That connection has qualities as well as quantities. That the history of science has slowly moved toward a more honest account of what people ask of one another simply by being human. The search, then, is not over. It may never be, but perhaps that is fitting, because the subject was never only loneliness. It was always the larger mystery of what makes a life feel shared. What allows another presence to become a place of rest, and why the mind keeps reaching for forms of belonging that are at once ordinary, fragile, and essential. What this story leaves behind is not a neat cure, but a sharper way of seeing loneliness is not exposed by counting the number of people in a person's life. It appears in the gap between contact and attunement, between being surrounded and being known. That shift in understanding changed the subject in a profound way. It moved loneliness out of the realm of vague sadness and into something more exact, something shaped by early bonds, social expectation, culture, memory, and the mind's constant effort to judge whether closeness is real enough to rest in. Seen that way, the feeling becomes both more painful and more intelligible. It helps explain why company can sometimes feel strangely weightless, why conversation can leave no trace of comfort, why a person may be included and still not feel held. The science does not make the experience less human. If anything, it makes it more so It shows that the mind is not only looking for other people, it is looking for recognition, steadiness, and the quiet assurance that its presence lands somewhere. And perhaps that is why the search is still unfinished. The more carefully loneliness has been studied, the more it has revealed that belonging is not a simple social fact. It is something interpreted, remembered, tested, and felt. We are still learning how that feeling is built, why it slips, and what helps it return. For now, the most honest conclusion may be this: a person can stand in the middle of other lives and still ache for connection, not because something is broken in the idea of human closeness, but because closeness itself is far more fragile and far more meaningful than it first appears.